What is a geography fact that blows your mind? Story 1. The Dead Sea is currently 429 meters below sea level and sinking about 1 meter a year. I did some work in Jordan and that caused some GPS receivers to mess up as they thought the negative height was an error. Story 2. There's a small 1 kilometer square tip of Russia that points into Estonia. What makes this interesting is that there are some Estonian villages that for a long time were only accessible by a road that goes through this small bit of Russia. For convenience, they actually allow people to drive through there under the conditions that you have to travel by car and not stop. So it's possible to legally enter Russia without a visa, though be it for only a short while. Kind of a similar fact, Point Roberts, Washington is part of Washington State that pokes out of British Columbia, Canada. The only way to get there is to go through Canada. The area only has schools up to 1st or 2nd grade, so students have to go through Canada to go to school every day in, I think, Blaine, WA. Story 3. The USA is a lot further south, or Europe is a lot further north, depending on your point of view, than you think it is, despite having nearly the same climate. The major European city on the same geographical latitude as Toronto is not, as you might infer from the climate, something like Oslo, Norway, or Stockholm, Sweden. It's Florence, Italy. The same goes for New York City. It's Madrid instead of Berlin or Paris. All Europeans should really start to appreciate the Gulf Stream more. Otherwise, this would be a frozen wasteland. Story 4. France has a lot of geographical curiosities. A colonial past and 1,000 of complex history will do all sorts of things to a country's borders. A few examples. There's an island on a river on the French-Spanish border that is in France for 6 months of the year and in Spain for the other 6 months. It's historically a place of diplomatic encounters between France and Spain. Hopefully, no one lives there and access is forbidden or it would be an administrative nightmare. However, French people are allowed to fish in its water when the island is French and the Spaniards when it's Spanish. If you count the exclusive economic zone into a country's superficie, France becomes the 4th biggest country in the world. Thanks mostly to French Polynesia and New Caledonia, France's EZ is the 2nd biggest in the world. The sun never sets on France. Actually, Clipperton Island and Reunion Island, 2 French territories, are almost antipodal, which would make France, as far as I know, the only country to be antipodal with itself. The longest border shared by France and another country is with Brazil, thanks to French Guiana. The longest domestic flight in the world is in France, Paris to Saint-Denis, Réunion. Story 5. Well, it doesn't actually blow my mind, but I find it interesting nonetheless. When traveling 10 kilometers, 6.21 miles, seems quite a short distance. And horizontally you can cover this distance in like 2 hours by walking, 1 hour by running, or even in exactly 6 minutes by car driving 100 kilometers per hour, 62.14 miles per hour. But it's a whole different story trying to cover this distance vertically, whether it's reaching the bottom of the sea at a depth of 10 kilometers, 32,808.4 feet, or the Earth's highest mountains. Suddenly the distance doesn't seem so short anymore, and getting there without machinery is outright impossible because of the extreme magnitudes of pressure differences. Story 6. Not sure how mind-blowing this is, but it puts things in perspective. Source: 59% of the world's population lives in Asia and 16% live in Africa, while Europe and North America are approximately 9% and 8% respectively. Looking at which continents are experiencing growth in their population, Africa's growth is about 2 to 3% between 2010 and 2016. In contrast, the percent growth in the same time period in North and South America, Oceania, and Asia hovers around only 1%. And Europe's growth is only 0.08%. In the US, at least in US schools, we minimize the importance of Africa and Asia, focusing almost entirely on North America and Europe. But there's so much to learn about the rest of the world. Story 7. This will probably get buried badly, but I always thought it was pretty amazing. There is a spot in the Pacific Ocean near the western coast of South America that has an antipode at the Bay of Tonkin in Vietnam. Both of these are part of the Pacific Ocean. That means you can travel half the world. a distance as big as it is from Spain to New Zealand, for example, and still remain within the ocean. It is absolutely staggering how tremendously huge the Pacific Ocean really is. Story 8. Russia is greater 115 times the size of Bangladesh, but home to 10 million fewer people. Scotland is one of the best countries in the world for hiking. This is despite every single square centimeter of land in Scotland being owned by someone. More than half of the Netherlands is below sea level. Most of the land in the Netherlands today didn't exist in the medieval era. Kalmykia is the only Buddhist state in Europe. It's what's left of Genghis Khan's Mongol horde. There are 11 indigenous languages spoken in the British Isles: English, Scots, Gaelic, Gaedlig, Manx, Gelgi, Irish, Gaelic, Gaeilge, Welsh, Cornish, Guernesiais, Jeriais, Xerxiais, and Nynorn. This doesn't include traveler languages such as Shelta. Coastlines get longer the more accurately you measure them. Their length tends towards infinity. Story 9. Not sure if this is exactly considered geographical, but it blows my mind beyond any semblance of comprehension. About 250 million years ago, a sort of fissure or rift, a mantle plume, if you will, opened in what is now known as Siberia. For nearly a million years, magma poured out from within the earth, bathing the land in an unfathomably ludicrous amount of lava. More than 300 million cubic kilometers of lava engulfed the area. If I recall correctly, it would be enough to cover the entire United States in 3 miles of lava. I may be mistaken on this, I can't recall exactly. The USA has a land mass of 3.797 million miles if you can math. This was a major attributed factor of the Permian-Triassic extinction event, in which 96% of all sea life and 70% of all land life was wiped from the earth. It took nearly 30 million years for life to recover from this event. Story 10. I teach 5th grade geography. The thing that I find the coolest is how everything makes sense. Why rivers are where they are, why mountains are where they are. Showing my kids the outlines of the world's tectonic plates and how the continents line up really paints a cool picture of what happens as the plates shift. It's fascinating to me how the Earth really is this giant moving, shifting thing that has been moving and shifting for about 4.5 billion years. Story 11. There's a street in Cincinnati that, due to the geography, you feel like you're facing upward, so when you throw your car in neutral and gravity pulls you downward and you roll forward, it appears to be uphill. Super cool trick to mess with superstitious friends and tell them there's a ghost or something. The street is across the river in Kentucky near Devou Park. The road is called Ridgeway, which itself kind of tells you what's actually happening. Really cool and fun to check out. I recommend doing it later at night. It's a residential neighborhood, so you want to be mindful of residents and traffic. Story 12. Rama's Bridge is a chain of limestone shoals between Pamban Island, also known as Ramaswaram Island, off the southeastern coast of Tamil Nadu, India, and Mannar Island off the northwestern coast of Sri Lanka. Geological evidence suggests that this bridge is a former land connection between India and Sri Lanka. Story 13. Michigan possesses some pretty unique geography facts. You can drive south from Detroit and end up in Canada. Just like how the US has a continental divide, water on the west side flows to the Pacific, and water on the east side flows to the Gulf or the Atlantic. Michigan has its own state divide. Water on the west side flows to Lake Michigan, and water on the east flows to Lake Huron. It takes over 10 hours to get from the SE corner of the state to get to the NW corner of the Upper Peninsula. Unless it's winter, then you better give yourself a few days. As someone else mentioned, Michigan is bigger than the entire UK, also has the most miles of state-funded ORV trails in the country, and has more miles of coastline than any other state in the country with the exception of Alaska. Story 14. There's a library on the border between Vermont, USA and Quebec, Canada. The border runs right through the middle of the building. Despite this, it's only legal to cross the border at designated checkpoints. There are residential roads that used to continue uninterrupted across the border, but now have Jersey barriers and fences blocking the road and signs that say it's illegal to cross. Many people would need to drive 10 plus miles and present a passport to get to their next door neighbor's house only 100 feet away. Story 15. Not just that we have a powerful magnetic field that protects us from the solar winds, but how we have it and how vital it is to our survival always intrigues me. The nickel-iron core of the planet with its very rapid rotation. The Earth may be slowly decreasing in rotation, albeit very, very slowly, would take millions of years to notice, but rather the Earth itself slows down than our home's core. Story 16, Point Roberts, USA, isn't connected to the USA, but connected to Canada. Some seriously odd crap. It's not an island, and yet it's completely separated from the rest of the US. The only way to travel from Point Roberts to the rest of Washington and the US is by passing through one international border, crossing into Canada, driving 25 miles, and passing through another international border crossing into the US, which is a daily trek for school kids above 3rd grade. Story 17. The tiny island of Britain controlled the biggest empire ever to exist. Large swaths of Africa were conquered largely to provide bases to ease the trip to India. India was conquered largely by accident by a private company. Large swaths of North America were conquered largely because, well, nobody really knows why. Australia was taken over because, well, have you ever tried to break a bad habit? You just keep relapsing. Story 18. Most countries don't have or use a global or even national map projection system. So, for example, the United States government uses one projection that might show the Mississippi River going through mainly Louisiana, but the state government of Louisiana might show the river going through Alabama. Even more absurd is the fact that Alabama and Louisiana don't even agree where the borders are, and some counties might not be claimed by either. I know that the UAE is similar, and Dubai uses its own map and borders, although surrounding cities do not agree, all because the map projection systems they use distort the maps differently. Story 19. There is a city in Hong Kong called the Kowloon Walled City. They have over 33,000 people living in one city block. When you do the math, 1173 city blocks per mile, it comes up to a whopping 351,900 people per square mile if it was bigger. What that means is that the entire human race can live together in a place that's about 3/4 the size of West Virginia, land only. That's insane. In comparison, Manila, one of the deepest cities in the world, has a population density per mile of just over 100,000. This city is 3 times that. Wow. Story 20. Olympus Mons, a possibly still active volcano on Mars, is larger than Mount Everest, slightly higher than Mauna Kea from its base on the ocean floor, and would take up most of France with its size. It rises 21 kilometers above the ground, and if you were to stand near the summit, being on the summit would be in magma, volcano. You wouldn't even know you were on a mountain, as it is so wide that it extends beyond the horizon. Story 21. Canada has the longest coastline of any country in the world at 243,977 kilometers, 151,600 miles. Half of the country is covered with forests, which should come as no surprise considering 1/10 of the world's forests are here. The population in Canada in 2011 was approximately 34.3 million, but the size of Canada itself is 9 million kilometers squared, but 90% of the population lives in the southernmost part. Story 22. An antipode is a point directly opposite of another point on the Earth, for if you had a globe and picked a spot, its antipode would be on the exact opposite side of the globe. The vast majority of antipodes land in the Pacific Ocean. It's that big. There are very few land-to-land antipodes, one of which is Taiwan, a province in northern Argentina. That province's name is Formosa. Taiwan's former name was Formosa. Story 23. You can actually see Russia from Alaska. In the middle of the Bering Strait are 2 small, sparsely populated islands, Big Diomede, which sits in Russian territory, and Little Diomede, which is part of the United States. At their closest, these 2 islands are a little less than 2.5 miles apart, which means that on a clear day, you can definitely see one from the other. Story 24. So the other day we were watching some show about Egypt, and it's telling the camels facts that they're adapted to eat cacti, and I said to my girlfriend wife, I didn't know they had cacti in Africa. And her, being a know-it-all, replies, well, maybe that's because they're in Egypt and not Africa, which of course led to me saying, Egypt is in Africa. She got this deer in the headlights to look on her face that was priceless and went, uh-oh, glorious. I get to use that for the rest of our lives, LOL. Story 25. Atlanta is on the same latitude as Baghdad. London is on the same latitude as Saskatchewan. The only place in the continental US where you could tunnel straight through the earth and hit land is in northwest Montana. You would come out on Kerguelen Island in the middle of the South Indian Ocean. The southern tip of Africa is barely halfway down the latitudes of Chile and Argentina. This is why Uruguay has the most southerly northern border in the world, just edging New Zealand. The most southerly city with a population over 100,000 is Dunedin, New Zealand. Story 26. My mind is blown every time I drive from Louisiana to Texas on 110. Right after you cross the border, there is a sign that says El Paso, 875 miles. It's more than a 12-hour drive from one border to the other on I-10. I grew up in Houston and now live in Austin, and every time I see this, it reminds me how enormous this state is and how much I love it. My entire family is from Oregon and California, so I didn't grow up hearing how amazing Texas was. I learned it by traveling by car with my family. We drove to CA numerous times in a van, and friends in college, and by studying Texas history and working at the Capitol as a tour guide while in college. I can't wait to take my kids, first-generation Texans on my side and at least sixth on the other, on trips like that. I have a lot of issues with Texas and Texans as an extremely liberal person living here, but the geography and landscape are amazing. Story 27. There is an island in the Canary Islands off the coast of eastern Africa that is volcanic. Half of the island is shifting into the ocean, making a canyon down the middle of the island due to structures made by the volcano inside the island. If the volcano erupts, it will melt those structures, causing trapped water to crash into the side of the island from the inside, and half the island will sink, causing a 100-foot minimum tsunami to cross the Atlantic at incredible speed and destroy everything 100 miles into the U.S. eastern seaboard. Story 28. The Grand Coulee megaflood carved the landscape of eastern Washington. The numbers used to describe it are staggering, but best described from the NASA link above. We think this was the largest flood ever to have occurred on our planet, says Patrick Burkhart, a geologist from Slippery Rock University in Slippery Rock, Penn, and one of the researchers who accompanied the LPSA interns. The scale was almost unearthly, practically impossible to imagine and describe. The story of this megaflood would be fleshed out over the next several decades by a host of researchers. Geologists would learn that the waters could have drowned a 40-story skyscraper, making them 20 times deeper than the Hurricane Katrina triggered, flooding that destroyed swaths of New Orleans and the Gulf Coast in 2005. Computer modeling would reveal that in the upper Grand Coulee, water charged over the cliff now called Dry Falls at the highway speed of 65 miles per hour. Dry Falls would be recognized as the largest waterfall to have existed on Earth, carrying 10 times as much water as all modern rivers combined. One key to piecing everything together would be the realization that what appear to be rolling hills in part of the Scablands are actually giant ripple marks left by the water's currents. These are like the ripple marks you might see when you're swimming in the ocean, looking down at the sandy bottom, explains Andrew Ryan, who was the student coordinator for the LPSA field trip and is now in graduate school at Arizona State University in Tempe. Except those ripple marks are 3 or 4 inches tall. The ones in the channeled Scablands are 30 feet tall. Story 29. A little different than the others posted, but the United States is the most tornado-prone country in the world, with an average of 1,200 tornadoes per year. After the United States, Canada is the second most tornado-prone country, with approximately 120 confirmed tornadoes each year. Second fun fact, wind speeds within an EF5 tornado can exceed 500 kilometers per hour, both in terms of horizontal and vertical wind speeds. To put that into context, Hurricane Katrina had peak wind speeds of approximately 280 kilometers per hour. Wind speeds in excess of 100 kilometers per hour begin to counteract the force of gravity, which is why there are so many incredible phenomena reported after strong tornadoes. Story 30, not really geographical, more historical actually, but if you travel to America, and I mean all of them, not only the USA, you will notice a leap from the ancient era to the Renaissance era in architecture, history, and culture. That's because while we were in the European conception of the ancient era, we were colonized by people in the Renaissance era, thus sparing us from passing through classical, medieval, and feudal eras. Yep, I based these divisions on civilization. Verse Story 31. The outline of an ancient coastline can be visualized in the spatial distribution of Democratic voting counties in the southeastern U.S. Fertile soils in that region were especially good for growing cotton during the South's agrarian history. Consequently, slave populations in that region were especially high. After the Civil War and since, those regions have continued to have disproportionately high populations of African American descendants of slaves, and African Americans in the South tend to vote disproportionately for Democratic presidential candidates. Story 32. Kentucky has an off-and-on border argument with Indiana and Ohio. The state lines are the Ohio River. Both Indiana and Ohio use the original course of the river from when Kentucky became a state in 1792. Kentucky argues that the northern shore is the border and they tax river traffic, gambling, and alcohol sales on the river. In places where the river has shifted south, Kentucky recognizes the original 1792 borders. Where it has shifted to the north, they argue that the northern bank is the border. Story 33. I'm from Oregon. So here are some interesting geographical facts about Oregon. All the wildlands in Oregon combined are about the size of Ohio out west. We have some pretty large counties. Oregon's 3 largest counties are in the SE corner together and are about the size of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and New Jersey, respectively. But their populations are 7,200, 30,380, and 7,829. Oregon was briefly its own country and at the time shared a border with Alaska, 54 degrees. Of the lower 48 states, Oregon has the westernmost geographic center and the westernmost city of over 50,000, Corvallis. Story 34. The U.S. states of Delaware, Pennsylvania, and Maryland has an interesting border. PA's southern border and Maryland's northern runs straight along the Mason-Dixon line at 39 degrees 43 S north, until it gets to the corner of Maryland, where it starts following an arc of a 12-mile circle, that's the official name, centered on the dome of the courthouse in Newcastle, Delaware. Meanwhile, the Maryland-Delaware border makes a sharp turn southward. 2 cool things about this. The PAD border is the only U.S. state border that follows a circle, nominally at least. The actual border is slightly distorted, but it's the only state border that's even based on a circle. The lines drawn by surveys to map the original colonial provinces of MD, DE, and PA were not accurate enough, resulting in a slice of land below the PA's southern border, east of Maryland's eastern edge, and outside of Delaware's circle. This wedge was disputed territory up until 1921, when it was determined to be part of Delaware. Story 35. If you pay attention to the westward expansion, in America you can see older, more traditional companies and professions on the East Coast like law firms, banks, and universities, with the Industrial Revolution and automation in the Midwest like car companies, energy companies, and on the West Coast you have postmodern internet and tech companies. It's an oversimplification because of franchise models and companies' expansions. But if you look at where companies were founded, industry leaders during that time, and where their global HQs are, we still see today the results of heading west for riches. Story 36. There's a cenote on the west side of the Yucatan that in the morning turns into a saltwater cenote from the Mediterranean River that runs under it. But in the afternoon, the river calms down and settles under the cenote, allowing the local freshwater river, or RIA, to settle, while the river runs right under it. It's in a protected animal sanctuary in Celestin, mostly known for its flamingos, the most beautiful, calm place I've ever been to.